Cathy Kavassalis is a passionate gardener and conservationist. As a scientist, educator, and inspirational speaker, Cathy endeavors to stimulate interest and awe in the living world around us. She is a wonderful friend and mentor to many, and gives her time generously to support gardeners, working incessantly to make sure they have scientifically based information. I could go on with Cathy's accomplishments and dedication, but we would be here for quite a while. We are so very pleased to have Cathy launch the first presentation in this webinar series, A Fresh Look at Gardening. Over to you, Cathy.
Well, thank you so much. That was very, very kind, Janet. And I'm really delighted to be with so many of you today. I saw some of the names coming in, some familiar friends, and welcome to you all. I'd like to begin on behalf of Halton Master Gardeners to acknowledge that the Halton region is in the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. Our region is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and it is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and it is directly adjacent to the Halton Treaty Territory. As gardeners, we recognize our responsibility to honor, respect, and protect the land, its waters, plants, and animals, and acknowledge its traditional guardians. And I think it's appropriate to begin our talks with these land acknowledgements. And in particular, today's talk is all about respecting and protecting the land, plants, and animals. So I'm hoping today that some of you who've been longtime gardeners are going to take a fresh look at how you garden and the choices that we make, because it's really all about the well-being of generations to come. A different way of looking at our gardens. In this photograph, you're looking at Lythrum salicaria, or purple loosestrife. It's an invasive species that was introduced by gardeners, and it highlights the importance that our plant choices can have. I'm going to talk about natives, nativars, exotic and invasive species, and help us to have a conversation about what is environmentally responsible gardening. Master gardeners basically agree that the advice that we give is scientifically based, and it is meant to promote sustainable gardening. What do we mean by environmental sustainability? It does matter. It is responsible interaction with the environment to avoid depletion or degradation of natural resources and to ensure the long-term environmental quality is sustained. Common questions that we get as master gardeners, and many of you have, is what should I plant here? Some of you have blank slates, some of you have mature gardens, and over the course of these sessions, we'd like to give you ideas of how you can change and transform your space, whether it's a balcony garden in a condo, to a large new subdivision, to an old mature garden. How do you transform it into an environmentally responsible landscape? We also get asked, how do you grow this? What's wrong with this plant? What is this? And oftentimes, how do I get rid of this? If we get the first question right, what should I plant here? Hopefully we can avoid the last, how do I get rid of this? Particularly, how do I get rid of this invasive species? So let's talk about plants and why do we choose them? They're chosen to meet needs and wants. They generally are for food, function, and fashion. So vegetables and fruits we grow in our vegetable spaces, but plants can also have functions. They can provide us privacy or shade. They can be play areas. And all of us would like to have something that's aesthetically pleasing. But fashions change and different cultures appreciate different kinds of textures and colors in the garden. And sometimes we need to sacrifice some of our fashion wants, our aesthetic desires, in order to promote environmental sustainability. Plants need to suit the location. So even though we might want to have a large vegetable garden, if you have a very shady lot or a shady space, it may not be appropriate for all vegetables. You may have clay, you may have sand, you may have wet, you may have dry. Each of these conditions require different plant selection. And during this seminar, we'll talk about, not today's seminar, but this series, we'll talk about how do you do a site assessment so that you can know what plants are best suited for your location. With so many plants to choose from, trees, shrubs, flowers, ferns, grasses, sedges, it's important that we try to choose a native species where possible. And that's going to be the focus of today's talk. And I'll try and give you some of the scientific reasons behind that. But I like to start by playing a game I call Where in the World? And I'd like you to stop and think about your garden, your neighborhood, your town or city, and the plants that are growing there. If you look at the picture, this picture on the right, it's a beautiful rose garden. Would you know where in the world it is? Think about it. It could be here in Ontario, but turns out this one is in Japan. You could pick a country anywhere in the world and you would likely find a rose garden, except perhaps Antarctica. How about these gardens? Salvia, dahlia, yarrow, miscanthus, pansy, snapdragon, kale. Many of you may grow these plants. Do you know where this garden is? Could you tell? Did you guess Australia? It is remarkable how we have moved plants around the globe, and that so many of us share, as gardeners, some of the same plants, even though we live in very, very different climates and ecosystems. How about this garden? Goldenrod, Joe Pyeweed, New England aster, sandbar willow, woodland sunflower. Well, some of you, a light may have gone off because you may recognize these as being native to Ontario. But this garden happens to be in Herefordshire, England. Something is wrong with this. This globalization of plants, the moving plants around the globe, has some serious consequences. Gardening is the largest pathway for the intentional introduction of invasive alien species, and we'll talk more about that later. But as we introduce more non-native exotic species, we are diminishing the space that's available for native species. And science has shown us that non-native species are second only to direct habitat loss as the cause for the decline and extinctions of species across the planet. And this is from the International Union of Conservation of Nature. It may seem like what's happening in our space doesn't matter, but collectively it makes a difference. In the United Nations wrote a report 2 years ago now, Nature's Dangerous Decline. The unprecedented species extinction rates are accelerating. Professor Joseph Satil wrote, ecosystem species, wild populations, local varieties, and breeds of domesticated plants and animals are shrinking, deteriorating, or vanishing. The essential interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. This loss is the direct result of human activity and constitutes a direct threat to human well-being in all regions of the world. It's that interconnected web of life that we need to think about. The population trends of animals around the world signal that something is fundamentally broken in the relationship between humans and the natural world. The World Wildlife Report has done global wildlife population trends and have shown that they've fallen 68% in less than 50 years. And at-risk species in Canada have seen their populations decline 42%. It doesn't quite paint the picture because really there are some things that are doing extremely well. Eugene Schieffelin, who was a pharmacist back in New York in the 1800s, decided it would be good to release all the birds that were in Shakespearean plays, and he released 60 European starlings. Today, there are over 200 million North American starlings that came from that one release. And the same has happened with plants. We move and release our plants and we are creating winners and losers, some really big winners and some really big losers, and a lot in between. And that's bad, according to macroecologist Dr. Brian McGill. The Carnaby blue butterfly is a tiny, maybe insignificant butterfly. It's now disappeared from Ontario. It's extirpated because it requires native lupins and not Western lupins. Many of us have introduced lupins in our gardens, the beautiful Lupinus polyphyllus, the Russell hybrids. Those do not support this little butterfly. And in fact, as it hybridizes with our native lupin, Lupinus perennis, it no longer can support this one little species. But you add all of these changes up and it starts to cause the shrinkage of numbers. Like the starlings, we've introduced many plants which have no natural checks to their growth. The tree of heaven, quite a pretty tree. It has been spread. It's now spreading quite rapidly in southern Ontario. It at first lacked any natural herbivores, parasites, or diseases. None of our native species knew what to do with it. Unfortunately, also having been introduced is something called the brown marmorated stink bug, an invasive species. And coming very soon to Ontario, the spotted lanternfly. These really like the tree of heaven. If they just stuck to the tree of heaven, that would be great. But unfortunately, these are generalists and they like all of our native plants too. And in fact, too much. So when we introduce species and some of their associated species, sometimes we do incredible environmental harm. There have been reports over the last 2 years of plummeting insect numbers threatening the collapse of nature. Many species of insects are in decline and pollinators in particular in trouble. I'm not sure these apocalyptic sort of nature is dying is particularly helpful because it makes many people sort of close their eyes and not want to deal with it. But there is no question that something is wrong. Death by 1,000 cuts. The combined impact of loss of habitat, fragmented habitat, loss of native plants, pesticides use and pollutions and other factors are causing insects in particular to start blinking out of existence. Pollinators, we really can't do without. Biodiversity overall is changing, and because there's an awful lot of bird watchers, we have noticed in birds particularly how these populations are different. In North America, bird populations have dropped by 3 billion since 1970. Now, not all birds are really suffering. Some are doing quite well. The Canada goose, for instance, does extremely well with lawns, expanses of lawns, as does robins. They like earthworms and that kind of thing. They've adapted well. But our insectivores declined by at least 59% since 1970, and grassland birds 57%. Again, those that are primarily require insects are the ones being most seriously harmed by what's happening with sort of the redistribution of insect populations. Native plants are really needed. There's a lot of research that's been done by the research team that's been headed up by Dr. Doug Tallamy at the University of Delaware. Many of you probably know the story that a single pair of breeding chickadees must find 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of young. But newer research by one of Dr. Tallamy's students, and now a doctor in her own right, Desiree Narango, basically looked in neighborhoods to see where did chickadees go in order to get their food. And what she discovered, and the map on the right shows a little neighborhood, was that the chickadees flew to where they could find native trees that were supporting native caterpillars. They found that if those plants constituted less than 30% of the sort of the biomass that was there, the chickadee populations could not be sustained and chickadees would start to fall off. And this is part of the problem you're seeing with species around the country, is that they can continue, but the populations are dropping. They cannot sustain their populations. The same is not true just for, say, insects that are on native species, but also some of the fruiting shrubs and plants that we grow. People will see something like the common buckthorn, which is highly invasive, but full of berries, and you might see birds eating it. But in fact, those berries are not good nutrition for birds. And a lot of the introduced species don't have the right balance of fats and sugars that support both breeding and migrating birds. And they've found in some recent research that really our native species, again, are just more supportive of native birds. When we choose exotic species, native flora decreases. With decreased native flora are a decline in native fauna, the birds, the bees, and the butterflies. You know, expanses of things like periwinkle, Vinca minor, are really, really pretty. And I've heard people say, well, I can see bees on it. And if you look closely, you might see European honeybees on it. Yep. It's a European species and it supports European insects, and it may support some of our generalist pollinators here as well. But in fact, plants like Berberis japonica or barberry and vinca, one of the reasons we like them is because they don't show many holes in their leaves. They don't have any blemishes on them because they have none of the natural checks and balances. They offer very little for mammalian herbivores and our pollinators. One study that just came out on Japanese barberry, for instance, looked overall when they saw that barberry got into the woodlands, and it showed that the diversity of arthropods, those are the insects, spiders, pill bugs, all those little creatures, both above ground and below ground, the things that decompose the leaves, the little pill bugs, roly-polies, some people call them, and millipedes and centipedes, they start to disappear. And then the predators that eat those herbivores and dendrivores also diminish. So these are complex food web things that are going on. Why should you care? While human health and well-being is inextricably linked to planetary systems, the integrity of the natural environment needs to be protected in order for us to ensure the long-term health of human populations. We think about gardens as just sort of the pretty plants that we grow, but in fact, there's a whole lot of things happening under the earth to the soil biota and above the earth to the way nutrients are cycled, carbon going into the air, oxygen. These are very complex, interconnected webs. And during evolutionary time, native species have kind of evolved in certain regions to let these systems occur in more healthy fashions. Native plants are anchors to healthy, biodiverse ecological communities. Native species are members of assemblages of organisms. They have predators, they have parasites, they have things that are mutualists, that like mycorrhizal fungi that grow with them, or commensalists that grow happily beside them. And it takes centuries for these relationships to evolve. Gardens can do more than just be pretty. In this year's Journal of the American National Academy of Sciences, January was entirely dedicated to what's happening to insects and insect decline. One of the papers by scientists had a series of recommendations that we can all do to help create more insect-friendly habitats. And later in this series, you'll have an opportunity to learn more about how to attract beneficial insects to your garden. But in general, the things we can do are simple. We can convert more lawns into diverse natural habitats. We can reduce pesticides and herbicides and our fertilizer use. We can limit the use of external lighting. I think many people don't realize that external lighting affects pollinators. It affects moths during the night, and that in turn actually affects pollination during the daytime. Won't get into that during this talk, but very interesting research there. We need to become educators and ambassadors and advocate for insect conservation. When you see, like in the upper right, that little ooey bug that you say, yuck, well, that's a ladybug larva. It consumes vast quantities of things like aphids. And we need to encourage more of those in our garden. We need to get involved to support good science and to vote, where possible, to protect native flora. And most of all, we can grow native plants. And if you're growing exotic plants, excuse me, like the dahlia in the lower left, choose exotic plants that can support life, that can support pollinators or something. Some of the dahlias have no pollen. They've been bred so that they are completely petals, and they have nothing to offer native insects or exotic insects. So be thoughtful when you make your choices. Basic definitions. It's hard, I will tell you. Native and indigenous species have many definitions, and it can vary by who you talk to. In general, species that occur naturally in a particular region or ecosystem that evolved in concert with other naturally occurring species is what we describe as native. That can change over time. Obviously it does. Plants migrate into new areas. Native species can mutate and become different, distinct species. So this is not something that's hard and fast. There is a gray area all around the edges of what a native species is. When someone tells you they have something that's native to North America, it may actually not be native to Halton region, and it may in turn be invasive. Exotic species then are those species that don't occur naturally in a region, or they may be cultivars, which have actually no natural range. The rose that's in this picture doesn't exist anywhere in the wild. This is completely manufactured by people. Now, some exotic species can support native wildlife, they can support many things, but we need to think about it and ask ourselves questions about the various species. And of course, then there are the invasive alien species. These are exotic species whose introduction does or is likely to cause harm to the economy, the environment, or human health. Something like multiflora rose, and you may look at that and say, well, I can see it has pollen. Doesn't it feed the pollinators? It can do some ecosystem services, but it tends to gobble up land space and push out other native species, and it simply does not serve the same support functions that our native roses or other native shrubs can do. And then there are some potentially invasive, and this is very difficult. I'll talk a little bit more about invasives in a little bit, of how do you predict when something is going to be a problem. Rugosa, Rosa rugosa would be a good example. It is now listed in many of the United States, like Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Delaware as an invasive species. It hasn't made Ontario's list, but I suspect it will with climate change and growing populations of it. A cultivar is an interesting thing. This term refers to a plant that's selected by people, distinguished by some trait like flower color, size, or plant form. And those traits are retained by reproduction. It may be retained if it's reproduced by seed, or if it's reproduced by a cutting, or even if it's reproduced by, some micro technique or just taking a few cells. That's a cultivar. A nativar is kind of a made-up term. It's a cultivar of a native plant. It may be naturally occurring. I've given examples up at the very top. There are 3 trilliums. It's all Trillium grandiflora. The one in the middle is called Forma roseum, and the one on the right is Flora pleno. They were naturally found growing in somebody's woods somewhere, and someone thought, wow, let's sell this in the trade. And so it became a nativar. Now, these are naturally occurring nativars, but they can also be produced through selective breeding. And some of the nativars you're seeing now of things like coneflower that have really aberrant floral heads are really of very little use to pollinators. Some of the foliage may still be used to native herbivores, but again, not all nativars are created equal, and they need some thought. Small genetic mutations in plants make an enormous difference to what can be supported. Here is a picture of our native red trillium, Trillium erectum and Trillium grandiflorum, the white trillium. They look pretty similar, except you might say, well, color is different. Those colors are actually flags to attract their pollination partners. The red trillium produces a fetid smelling flower, and it attracts carrion flies as its primary pollinator, whereas the white trillium has a more conical flower, and it has nectaries in the bottom, and it is pollinated by long-tongued bees in the Bombus genus. These little mutations occur by natural selection, and they occur over time. It causes speciation when they get separated so much so that they can no longer sort of interbreed and create new species. Interestingly enough, both our red trillium and our white trillium require another partner, and that is ants. Their ants have, the trillium seeds have packets of elasome. It's a lipid-rich substance right on the outside of the seed. The ants want to eat it, so they grab onto the seeds, they pull it back to their homes, and on the way they lose a few, and that's how the seed is spread in forests. So it's a relationship that grew over thousands of years, but it's these kinds of complex relationships that sometimes we don't see. So when a species blinks out of its existence, we don't realize that maybe 3 or 4 that are closely tied to it may disappear as well. Think about Halton region, or wherever you are, as an ecosystem. Within it, there are communities of plants. There are populations of plants with unique genetic diversity and individuals that may have unique resilience for climate change, for pests, for predators. If we don't protect this unique native diversity, we lose resiliency, and we may not be able to adapt when stress comes. Well, let's be clear. I don't want to say that all exotic species are doing harm. Most of our food crops are exotic species. Apples are everywhere, and I'd say largely they've been beneficial. But, and also more exotics, well-behaved perennials like the peonies, the herbaceous peonies. I think the tree peonies are a little bit more problematic. They don't support a lot of native biodiversity, but they do tend to stay put. And so there is space for these in your gardens. But let's try and keep them sort of under that magic 30% that Dr. Talamy's group has sort of identified as being critical. There can be space for exotic species, the well-mannered ones, but we need to say no to the invasive species. And the problem is with some of these, like goutweed, which is defined to be a transformer, that is, it comes in and it truly does remove everything else that can grow. People will say it's an easy ground cover, nothing else will grow. I keep it contained, it's not a problem for me. Well, the evidence suggests that it doesn't stay where it's planted, that these things do spread and they are causing serious harm. It is invasive because it has been measured to be doing harm. Gardening, as I said earlier in the talk, is the largest pathway for the introduction of invasive alien plants. We have about 4,000 native species of plants in Canada, and 486 are invasive. In Ontario, we have only 2,000 native species and 440 are invasive, and that number is growing. It's interesting that Ontario is the site, it's a hotbed for invasive plants. They come in through us purchasing them directly, but they also come in unintentionally through our seeds and garden supplies. In fact, 72% of the unintentional introductions we are also indirectly responsible for. How do we define an invasive species? How do we know when it's going to be invasive? And this is really a problem because oftentimes they aren't vetted in the horticultural trade. Someone will see something beautiful and they'll say, oh, this is great. Let's put it, we'll sell it, we'll market it. And it's only over time, and sometimes it takes decades and even centuries to see that something has done a lot of harm. How much space does it occupy? That's one question that's asked. How does it spread? Does it spread prolifically by seeds or does it spread by rhizomes? And once it spreads, how difficult is it to control? And it's not just plants that are in this mix. Of course, we've added a lot of other invasive species like earthworms, and they often work in conjunction with the invasive plants we've introduced so that it makes it very difficult to sort of reestablish or restore native communities. And it's not that we can get back to some kind of mythical, things were perfect before the European settlement came. We can't roll the clock back, but we can slow the process of extinctions and decrease the rate of decline of species if we can slow the spread of these invasive species. There's a lot you can learn about. As Janet mentioned before the talk, I've made a PDF that links a lot of the papers and a lot of the material that I'm talking about this morning, so you can go through it at your leisure. I highly recommend the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's work. They are underfunded and undersupported, but they've done tremendous work on writing up best practices for removal and identification and what to plant instead. We also need to be looking towards the United States because what is going to be our next invasive species often is moving northward. So when you see things like 10 invasive perennials to avoid or 17 attractive invasive species that will take over your garden, some of those may not be a problem here today, but they are likely to be a problem a decade from now. Credit Valley also offers a really nice collection of things on invasive plants. I think a little bit better than our Halton Region Conservation does. And again, I'll link that for you. So how do you choose the right plants? Well, you need to know your soil conditions, your light conditions, your moisture conditions, and a little bit later on, let's see who's going to be doing that. I think Isabel is going to do that in starting from scratch. So you'll learn about doing site plan assessments. How do you begin? Well, there actually is no recipe. And next week, Janet will talk about how you can reimagine a home landscape, and she'll take you through some steps she did with reimagining her own space, given the complexities of things that are going on. We all have unique growing conditions, unique goals, and unique styles. But we can start by thinking about really the big picture. Our little gardens may seem insignificant, but taken together, they do represent a large piece of land, and they fit within these larger regional ecozones. Ecozones are based on climate, topography, soil, and moisture, and they vary around the world, and they occurred because of sort of evolution, the way plants got distributed. But think about the unique plants and animal communities that are around us. The mixed wood plains is phenomenal. It's very biodiverse. It is the most southerly ecozone within Ontario. There are 3 others, the Boreal Shield and the Hudson Bay to the north, and each one of them has a different set of plants, unique flora and unique fauna. By protecting or preserving some of the native species within those regions, we can ensure that that flora and fauna can be sustained into the future. There's more information still on ecoregions and even eco-districts. In Halton region, for instance, we are in what's known as 7E4 and 7E3. These are minute eco-districts, but again, they have unique plants. The Forest Gene Conservation Net is one of my favorite websites. Their association, they've built a lot of information on why local genetics is important, and they provide you things like a woody species plant lists. So you can get there a list of all the trees and shrubs that are appropriate for our eco district. So again, pull up 7E4 if you're closer to Toronto, and 7E3 if you're closer to Grimsby. If you've got the space, so not for condos, but if you've got the space and you have room, start with trees and shrubs. These have the greatest impact on native biodiversity. They support the greatest number of species, and they are really kind of an easy way to solve some of the problems with life declining, particularly if you select keystone species. Again, Dr. Ptolemy's research has shown us that about 5% of our native plants feed about 75% of caterpillars. These key species are critical to supporting kind of a large number of other species. Things like oaks, cherries, willows, birches, cottonwoods, and elm trees. An oak will support, say, 521 species of caterpillars in North America and northeastern United States, whereas an aspen 360. And some sort of unique things may support very few. It doesn't mean that the other species aren't key for the survival of some specialist species, but if you don't have a lot of space and you want to have the greatest impact, then keystone species are the ones to select. There are also keystone perennials, asters, goldenrods, sunflowers, Joe Pyeweed. Again, they don't have the impact of trees, a goldenrod 138 versus an oak 521, but they really can make a huge difference. So my advice is to plant a variety of plants biased towards native and near native species, with a selection of exotics to extend your flowering season and add a bit of eye candy. So this Celosia argentea variation spicata is one of my favorites, and my goodness, come late fall, the monarchs seem to really love it. And there's a lot of research going into which kinds of plants can extend the season and help pollinators to survive. Generally, these are for sort of the generalist species or the migratory species. Specialist species require very particular plants in the garden. Designing with plants is where art meets science, and there is no reason why plants that are full of native species cannot be beautiful. Sometimes it's redefining how we see beauty, and sometimes they're simply beautiful, plain and simple. I look on the web often to get inspiration gardens. I love this one by Thomas Lynch with our native Echinacea pallida, which is underplanted. Oftentimes we're choosing the Echinacea purpurea, the sort of the larger coneflower. I think this one just dances in the wind and is so much more attractive. Here it is with our native butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. Make your plant lists. Create your palette of plants that will work for your space, and then look for inspirational designs and remake them for your space. Your style can be very formal or informal, but you can make it ecologically sound by the way you choose your plants, how you care for your soil, and all the kinds of things that reducing fertilizer, attracting beneficial insects. These things can make a tremendous difference. There are excellent resources, and I have filled a couple pages with these for you in the PDF that's associated with this talk. The USDA has Attracting Pollinators to Your Garden. I love the books by Doug Tallamy, Nature's Best Hope. He just published, it's on, I'm waiting to get it with bated breath, a book about native oaks and keystone trees that's just been released. The Great Lakes region has released plant lists for pollinators. And so you will find that there are many, many of these resources that can make beginning not quite so difficult and overwhelming. There are even pre-made suggestions for you. If, for instance, you wanted to make it your goal to try and save Bombus affinis, or rusty-patched bumblebee, which is really down to handfuls of species across the province. If you live in an area where these have been sighted, you could create a pollinator patch for the rusty patch bumblebee. And again, some of these have been pre-made for you to try. And oops, sorry, went too far. You can also just incorporate some species within your vegetable patches, which is going to be full of exotic plants. But by incorporating native species or plants that will attract beneficial bugs and pollinators, you can make it productive, healthy, and beautiful. And for this, for instance, Plant Partners just came out by Jessica Wallitzer. It's a science-based companion planting strategies for you. She's got designs and ideas that are all ready to go. In the end, I would suggest that you try to buy your plants locally. Halton Region Master Gardeners has put up native plant nurseries on our website, and you can pull up a map to show you where these are. Many of them sell their plants online. You can have them delivered right to your door. And then there are many places like Oakville Rain Conservation Association, which has started their native plant sale for spring. You can just go to their website and order a pre-made pollinator kit. The Forest Gene Conservation Association will talk to you about seed zones and why looking for plants that came actually from your eco-regions and eco-districts is important. And again, that has to do with that kind of unique genetic diversity. Too much to talk about this morning, but you can learn more from the Forest Gene Conservation folks. Upcoming Lunch and Learn seminars are going to help you. The next step will be reimagining the home landscape with Janet McKee, and then we'll go with starting from scratch, garden facelifts, beneficial insects, and your nature-friendly garden throughout the year, which we'll talk about sort of maintenance of this all. And I strongly encourage you to come for the rest of this series to get sort of the more practical things about moving ahead. Together, we can make a difference. If we're thoughtful, our gardens interlink and form a tapestry that can support life. And I thank you for your time this morning, and I'm hoping you have some questions.
Hi, Cathy.
Thank you, Cathy. That was an excellent presentation. We did receive a couple of questions, but we invite everyone to send us more. The couple that we received were about invasive species, which Claudette has been answering as they come in. Some people were shocked to know that Rosa rugosa was not native to Ontario. And one of the questions was if you have any tips for getting rid of goutweed.
Sure. I actually am working on a talk on invasive species for next week, so I've been thinking a lot about this. For most invasive species, the reason they are invasive is that they are non-trivial to remove. If it was really easy, they wouldn't make the list. People would just say, oh, just yank them out. So goutweed spreads by, as you know, that network of little rhizomes. And if you leave even a little bit in the ground, it will resprout. If you're lucky enough to have an open space in the sun and you can remove your other perennials, probably the easiest thing is to cut it clear to the ground in early spring, water the ground well, and put 2 to 3 millimeters of clear plastic and solarize this place for the summer. I've done that here in Parry Sound, and I'm delighted to say that quite a large expanse of goutweed has gone. Unfortunately, I also have goutweed that's growing in amongst tree roots and perennials that cannot be moved. In this case, it requires simply persistence and timing. So never let it go to seed. Keep cutting it back and there are some really nice tools for this. I have a little Japanese hoe, which has a very sharp edge, and I can just slice right at the top of the ground, at the crown. You keep preventing it from photosynthesizing. It's a pain. You have to do it constantly. So if you cannot dig and sift your soil, you've got to just keep cutting it back above the crown to prevent photosynthesis. Eventually it will starve, but it is a multi-year process. And of course, you've got seed banks, so the seeds stay in the soil and may keep emerging for some time. So with all invasive species, it's a matter of sort of vigilance, going out and continually cutting them back where you can. If you're able to dig areas up and sift the soil for the rhizomes, well, you can get rid of it. If you're not, you've just got to be persistent. A lot of invasive species, you know, people will say, well, put newspaper over or mulch them deeply. That can work. But if it's right in the base or coming up through other perennials, if you put too much either tarp or newspaper or anything under there, you're going to cause the soil to suffocate. There's no oxygen exchange. So you have to be very cautious about such situations of coming too close to your desired plants. And that's where the problem with me comes in. They're all interlaced, and some things I cannot get out of the ground. So in those cases, it's persistence. I hope that answered the question.
For your great responses to the questions. There are a few more. I encourage the people who are on here today to register for the upcoming webinars, because some of those will include answers to your questions. Cathy, I know you've inspired me to make some changes to our garden. I'm sure the information you shared with us today will inspire others to share that with their neighbors and fellow gardeners. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending today.